Okay, hi everybody. I do want to make a start relatively quickly. My name's Alistair Stark. I am known to some of you, but not all. I am the director of the Graduate Centre of the School of Political Science and International Studies. And welcome to a flashpoint on the election. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we live and work. Here at UQ, that's the Yagara and the Turrbal peoples of Brisbane. I want to pay our respect to elders past and present, and also, in keeping with the theme today, recognise that the politics of First Nations sovereignty is very much live and ongoing and a feature of this election. And that means there's an obligation upon this school to learn as we try and move towards reconciliation. And as we always do, I want to end the acknowledgement by warmly welcoming any and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues. So today's panel is going to be good fun, I think. We're going to focus beyond the election. Political scientists get a bit too excited about elections. They try to predict them and always fail. And we always want to be ahead of the curve, but rarely do we get an opportunity to actually ask and then reflect on what comes after. So that's what today's panel has been challenged to do, to think about the problems, the possibilities and the policies that we might get over the next 3 years. And things are moving fast. This morning we had a Labour majority confirmed as McNamara was declared first thing in the morning. And that's a huge issue, isn't it, for reducing problems and opening up possibilities, and certainly widening the scope of potential policies. And I think just as we were coming here, the cabinet was being formed in the Labour caucus. We might have more of that later. So we're going to do 5 to 7 minutes for each speaker. We'll go through each one. I'll introduce them as we go, and then we'll have questions at the end. One of the reasons we do these flashpoints is to introduce our students and other researchers in the university to timely topics, but we also do it and run it out of the Graduate Centre so I can promote our wonderful graduate offerings. And we do have some undergrads here, and it would be remiss of me in my role as Graduate Centre Director not to alert those students to the fact that the good people that you see staring back at you at the panel here at the front have all been heavily involved in our wonderful postgraduate offerings. Okay, let's begin. I'm going to start with Associate Professor Matt McDonald, who's going to talk to us about climate change policy, which is an area where we've already seen movement from the ALP. Associate Professor McDonald is an international relations scholar, and his most recent book was entitled Ecological Security, Climate Change and the Construction of Security. He's currently engaged in an ARC discovery project, which is looking at comparative national approaches to the climate change security relationship. And he's the author of no fewer than 49 articles on this topic. And he's also been a fantastic teacher into our Masters in International Relations program, teaching foreign policy and diplomacy consistently for many years. Matthew, you have the floor. You have to come up here.
Great. Thanks very much for that. Thanks very much for that introduction, Al. I didn't actually know the 49 thing, and as someone who used to play cricket at junior level, I'm now desperate to make it to that half century. So that'll get me back researching now that the teaching semester's winding up. It is acutely difficult in Australia generally, but certainly in the course of the last few years, to even think about separating climate policy from climate politics and even from electoral politics. So I'm going rogue with the very first presentation and starting with the election, because I think actually the electoral politics there are so significant to the trajectory for climate policy in Australia looking forward. So of course, climate change played a really significant role in the election, but not necessarily in the way we might have expected going in. It was less years ago, and under the Shorten when Bill Shorten was leader of the ALP in 2019, took them to the election with a promise of leadership on climate change that didn't go as well. And there was obviously a bit of a scare campaign from the coalition against it. This time around, Labor seemed desperate to make themselves a small target on climate change. And so actually what we saw was that climate change played a big role in the election, but mainly in terms of the success of Greens candidates and so-called teal candidates in inner city seats in Sydney and Melbourne, in the case of the latter, and actually just undermined the case for the coalition, because it was very difficult for them to simultaneously pretend that they were had any ambition on this issue, but couldn't run a scare campaign against Labor because Labor's targets were deliberately just a little bit more circumspect, a bit more pragmatic than in previous years. Indeed, it's no surprise that actually Labor went to the election not just with a lower emissions reduction target than they had in 2019, this 43% reduction by 2030, but also that they went to the election with the centrepiece of their policy called Powering Australia. It was all focused on the idea of how action on climate change could be consistent with jobs and economic growth. And so they were desperate to avoid this narrative that the Australian people had a choice facing them between jobs and the economy on one hand and climate policy on the other. So where does that leave us in terms of the future, looking forward, based on that election outcome and the success of the ALP, and crucially, the success of Greens and Independents candidates? There's going to be a lot of pressure on Labor to ramp up its targets and ambition on climate change. I suspect that will be unsuccessful in the short term in terms of changing Labor's emissions reduction targets. I think Chris Bowen, who's likely, if he hasn't already, been anointed as the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, has made it clear already that he's unlikely to want Labor to shift on that issue. Where we might see greater levels of ambition is certainly in terms of statements at international fora. Already Australia, under Penny Wong as Foreign Minister and Albanese as Prime Minister, have really been leveraging this idea that they are far more ambitious than they used to be on climate change. They are taking this issue seriously. They hear the voices of neighbours in the Pacific and are desperate to respond to their concern about this existential threat that is constituted by climate change. So in that context, Australia will really be trying to convince the international community that, well, actually it's a low bar. Really, we just have to move out of total pariah status to be an improvement on the current government. So that's already, that box has probably been ticked already, just with some sense of this is a genuine problem and we have more ambition to address it. But going forward, my sense is that the key challenges and where the Greens and Independents, if they are keen to push the ALP on this particular issue, my sense is that that will largely be in terms of ramping up the mechanisms to actually get us there. So really pushing the government to do as much as is possible on renewable energy, trying to incentivize the market to take up as much slack as it can to push further in this direction, and actually try to encourage the ALP not just to meet the less ambitious targets that it's announced in the lead up to the election, but actually surpass them. Now that in turn will mean, again, more market pressure to move away from fossil fuels and opening up the possibility that we'll see genuine sort of business sort of model, business case for that type of change. But it will also mean that it's easier then subsequently for the government to make a case, do you see, we can have these ambitions, we can make this transition without the sort of costs that the coalition used to terrify people we were all going to be facing. Now, on some of these issues, I expect them not to necessarily be challenged to the same degree we might expect if Barnaby Joyce was still leader of the Nationals. Obviously, David Littleproud was one of the advocates in the party room for net zero emissions and seemed to see the writing on the wall that Barnaby Joyce was unable to, and Matt Canavan was unable to for such a long period of time, around the need to at least commit to something as minimal as net zero emissions. So we'll see less pushback on that type of ambition, but where the rubber hits the road in terms of what some of these initiatives are for increasing renewable energy capacity, what some of these initiatives are for transitioning to electric vehicles, and what implications this might have for employment, for prospects of rural and regional towns, that's going to be where we see contestation, I expect, from a coalition, especially the Nationals in that context. So the signs so far are generally and very cautiously positive in terms of what pressure is going to come on the ALP, and the possibility, if we do think that essentially its climate policies were announced in the lead up to the election, really almost exclusively with the election in mind, and that there are a range of people in that party who would like to see stronger action on this issue, then the prospects are cautiously good for increasing levels of ambition over the course of the Albanese government, pushed along all the way by the Greens and the Teals. I'll leave it there.
Perfect timing, Hannah. Like that noted. Perfect timing. So as a Scotsman, I'm not trained to be positive, even if it's cautious. So let's see if we can maintain that as we go forward. We're going to go over to Liz Strakosch next to discuss Indigenous policy. Liz is a senior lecturer in public policy and governance in the school. She's the author of Neoliberal Indigenous Policy, Settler Colonialism and the Post-Welfare State. She's the winner of the Meyer Prize for the best paper in the Australian Journal of Political Science in 2020. And she's currently engaged in an ARC project entitled Revitalising Indigenous State Relations. She is, again, with my grad centre hat on, a significant presence in our honours programme who helped both design and run it over the years. Liz, over to you.
All right. Thanks, Al. Unlike Matt, I'm going to be quite well behaved and focus on the policy questions specifically, because as Al said, obviously in the acknowledgement, this is an area where there are really big political questions, including questions of sovereignty, contested government, racism, and state legitimacy. But I'm going to do something more specific here, which is look at what this government has proposed in policy terms, in terms of its concrete kind of promises, and assess that against the current status quo. And I've given it a score out of 10 for each area that I go through, on the basis of the understanding that any change is pretty good. Any considered change in this policy area, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, is a really good thing. And that is partly because since 2004, with the abolition of the self-determination era and the end of ATSIC, there has been kind of a period of bipartisan policy consensus, but it's been consensus around some really problematic things, including centralisation, paternalism, the abolition of consultation and representative structures, and the introduction of competitive funding and the defunding of the community-controlled sector. So none of these have been wildly successful. And on that basis, cautious optimism is probably a good assessment. My average score is 4.667 out of 10, which rounds up to 5. But having said that, if I was doing this for any of the past 3 governments, it would have been 0. Because even though in this area, we tend to think of this being really politicized, and it is politicized in one way, it's actually a really bipartisan area of policy. So it appears on our radar every now and then, and there's kind of big debates and energy about it, but under the surface, you can say this is one of the most bipartisan areas of policy. And ever since the kind of end of the self-determination era, that's really been the case. So the first thing is the Uluru Statement. Obviously, there's lots of progressive energy about this. People are really excited. And I give this 5 out of 10, which might be kind of a bit low, but here's my reasoning. In the context of big promises made by government to fundamentally redress the political conflicts in this society, we have absolutely been here before, right? So many, many times the federal government has explicitly promised and taken to an election that promise that they would either enact a treaty or with the end of the reconciliation era that they would enact reconciliation, including agreement making. Even the last Indigenous Affairs Minister, Ken Wyatt, promised he would bring a referendum in the 3 years, and they just don't, right? And there's a variety of reasons, but the main one is there's a risk assessment made and the government say, well, we just don't think it'll pass. It's not worth it. We're going to back off. And the kind of political consequences for that have generally not been that high. So on that basis, which is that, yes, enthusiasm and progressive energy for a significant change is a really important thing. That's great. And there are some real strengths in a constitutionally enshrined voice that can't be kind of abolished by the government at a whim. But there's also a danger in the kind of cycle of crisis and reinvention, as it's been called in Indigenous policy, where there's suddenly energy and they say everything we've done before is bad and we're going to revise it and we're going to fix it. And sometimes that has actually been quite a negative thing. So that was the kind of energy that was around before the Northern Territory intervention, which was a very hierarchical intervention that required the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act. So energy, political energy in and of itself, yeah, reasons for caution in this particular policy area. The second one is a bigger question about whether the government is actually addressing some of those fundamental material structures of policy that have been such a big problem in the last 15 years. And in this area, there's not actually any attention in their policy platform to that. So I give that 2 out of 10. That in particular, 2 areas would be the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, which was a catastrophic move in 2015 by the Abbott government to centralise all policy making in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, force all Indigenous organisations to go to tender, and that resulted in both massive mismanagement that was the result of various Senate inquiries and a massive defunding of the community controlled sector in the last 7 years. And in fact, Indigenous organisations were so upset about the Indigenous Advancement Strategy that Professor Megan Davis, who was involved in the Uluru Statement, said that negative energy had a real impact on the way people engaged with the constitutional reform process. So the level of dysfunction and mismanagement there is really problematic, and the government's not proposing to address that. Having said that, they might. But the last thing is that there are a few small and specific, but really promising commitments that they've made, which suggests to me that the government is actually listening in a way that previous governments haven't to some of the concerns and the campaigns that have been going in the sector, especially amongst Indigenous organisations. One of them is abolishing the cashless debit card, which is like a really punitive welfare quarantining mechanism. We shouldn't pat Labor on the back too much for that because they actually introduced it and expanded it. But, you know, good on them for seeing the error of their ways. They've just committed to abolishing that. And the second thing is that they're going to abolish the CDP, which most people don't know about, but has been a really, really, really negative Indigenous specific job ready kind of employment program, which has actually led, it's been incredibly expensive. It costs about 7 times to administer what the non-Indigenous job ready program costs. It involves much more punishment through the docking of welfare, and Indigenous people are pinged by Centrelink about 27 times more often in that scheme than in the other schemes. And they have committed to abolish that and consult and come up with a new scheme. So both of those things are excellent decisions. I give that 7 out of 10, which gives them an average of nearly 5.
That was a roller coaster of optimism and pessimism. So political scientists are often criticised for, you know, not being specific in their claims. 4.667 out of 10 is about as specific as you can get. Awesome. Okay, we're flying along in a rainbow of happiness here. Our next speaker is Dr. Adam Hanna. He's going to talk about social policy and health policy. Adam is a lecturer again in the school, a lecturer in public policy. specialises in health policy. He's published widely on the variants of health systems, more recently on a topical issue of vaccination, and prior to that, welfare state policy more broadly. Recent publications include the little-known journal Nature, which I'm told has an impact factor of sorts. But again, all I care about is that he teaches one of our core courses in the Masters of Governance and Public Policy, which is Law and Governance. Adam, the floor's yours.
Thanks again, Al. Thank you very much, everyone. So I think that my presentation is going to sit on the caution side. Both Liz and Matt have talked about energy, right? Energy and attention in their policy areas. I find it kind of ironic that with health and social policy, 2019 was really the election when there was a lot of attention, particularly from the Labor Party, paid to these areas, particularly around the notions of inequality, right? Economic and wealth inequality of various kinds. We're just coming out of a 2-year health crisis, right? Of an unprecedented scale. Yet, to a large extent, healthcare was off the agenda in the election campaign. And I think that's really interesting. Which is not to say that energy has completely dissipated. It's just maybe been pushed in different directions. Obviously, Labor, licking their wounds from the 2019 election, decided to take the small target strategy. And one of the lessons that they took, correctly or not, was that trying to redress inequality, tackling that directly, was a major electoral risk that they couldn't take on. So they've taken this small target strategy. But I think the focus, interestingly, has been channeled a little bit more through the Greens. I saw the Greens platform described on Twitter, I think it was Osman Chu, to describe it as a subtropical Corbynism, particularly, in the new state of Greensland that we have around in these inner city seats in Brisbane. The Greens have a very social democratic agenda. And I think that has been overlooked a little bit. Obviously, the focus on the environment has been their primary bread and butter. But they're proposing, their election platform had huge tax increases on the wealthy, massive expansion, access to services in terms of dental care, mental health care, so on and so forth. Clearly, they're not going to be driving the policy agenda. It's going to be Labor that's in government. But the fact that the Greens have 12 Senate seats and passing any major bit of legislation will usually require support from the Greens in the Senate. The fact that they've had an increase in the primary vote in the lower house when Labor has had, is sort of sitting only around 32, 33%. I think that side of the agenda is significant. So Labor, despite running this small target strategy, I think you're going to be pushed and pulled in multiple directions. Because on the other side, the Teals running in these inner city seats, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, are definitely not going to be on board with this social democratic agenda. Those wealthier areas of those cities, I think, while they reacted against sort of social conservatism in the Liberal Party, they certainly weren't reacting against the sort of pro-business, low regulation, low taxation agenda of the Liberal Party. Another major question that I think is an issue for any kind of expansionary agenda in health and social policy is how to fund it. While we might have our qualms about the way in which there's been a focus on debt and deficit in rhetoric and debate around Australian public policy, it is the case that the fiscal environment is going to be challenging going forward, particularly with high inflation, particularly given the huge amount of spending that the government had to engage in during the COVID pandemic. So just a couple of areas. I mean, there's a lot more than this that we could talk about in health and social policy, but I just wanted to highlight a few that I think are particularly important. The first one is a traditional area of fractiousness and debate in Australian public policy, which is the issue of hospital funding. Our hospital systems, pretty much in all of the states in Australia, are basically in crisis. That is partly to do with COVID, but not completely explained by COVID. Emergency room waiting times, ambulance ramping, the ability to access different kinds of services, nurses and doctors are completely burnt out, so on and so forth. These are major issues for our capacities to sort of deliver our normal expectation of health services going forward. So there's been a couple of incremental proposals from the Labor Party. They have this Medicare urgent care clinics that they're proposing to establish that may help in the short term in some way. But what I see being probably necessary is the states and the federal government to come to the table and renegotiate their agreement on hospital funding. While hospitals are administered by the states, a lot of the funding comes from and in fact, an increasing share over time has come from the federal government. It would be nice to see some much broader discussion of reform around how that system works. My expectation probably would be is the federal government will try to kick in a little bit more money, protect those Labor state premiers from frustration about bottlenecks in health services, but probably not much more than that. The COVID pandemic has highlighted the importance of mental health care, and that's going to be something that we're going to be dealing with, for the foreseeable future. There has been a bit of money, to give credit to the Liberal government. There's been quite a bit of money in the last couple of budgets, several $1 billion for expansion of mental health services. And the Labor Party are going to continue with that policy. Whether that will be enough, quite possibly not, but it is at least an expansion of needed services. The Greens have been going with this quite big proposal to include dental healthcare and Medicare, which I think, at least from a theoretical standpoint, is a very good idea. I don't see the Labor Party joining on board with that. They went to the 2019 election with a plan around expanding public dental care for pensioners, which they've since dropped. But it is the case that public dental care in this country is a disgrace, really. It's really, really terrible. It's a really, really important area of health services. Why we treat our teeth as somehow different from the rest of our body from a health service standpoint, I think is really a shame. But it would surprise me if there was a huge amount of action on that one. To pivot just briefly to social policy, the major plank of the ALP's platform here was around childcare. And increasing subsidies for childcare. I mean, childcare in this country is incredibly and increasingly expensive, so there's no doubt that would be an incrementally beneficial step. I'm not sure whether incrementally increasing subsidies in the short term will help the fundamental dynamics of the sector, which is that the costs keep going up and up and up, but it will certainly help in the short term. On parental leave, Labor has some sort of very vague plans to increase public parental leave to 26 weeks. It's currently at 20. That would be a good step. I would like to see a little bit more debate around how that is split up between parents. The coalition pivoted to a model where it's shared between both parents, and that usually ends up meaning that the mother ends up taking all of it. But we'll see where we go with that. Two other issues, just very briefly, that need, I think, action, but that haven't sustained that much attention during the campaign. There is a very widespread consensus in public opinion that it would be a good idea to raise JobSeeker. We saw that during the pandemic, that there was a significant raise in the rate of JobSeeker, that it cut rates of poverty very significantly. Labor is just really, really unwilling to commit to anything in that regard. Which I think is disappointing, given that there is a pretty high degree of public support for that. Housing is another major issue, incredibly huge issue in this country, because when we talk about inequality, what we face really is a wealth inequality issue. And with the huge increases in housing prices over the last several years, or really last several decades and beyond, you are seeing the development of quite, in many ways, a two-track society. Younger people looking to buy houses now are highly dependent on the wealth of their parents. And we've traditionally funded retirement security through the housing sector in Australia. Labor does have a policy of contributing to the purchase price of around 40% to some, opening up that access to that program to some groups of people on a targeted basis. Unfortunately, what we're doing is attacking the demand side rather than the supply side. So I would like to see more action on the supply side of building housing, of rethinking how our cities work. And just very finally, because Al's giving me the wind up here, the NDIS is a really important scheme. It's incredibly complex. The Liberal Party has unfortunately seen it as a budget burden and tried to find ways to cut costs. My hope is that Labor really focuses on how we can implement that system more effectively to ensure people that are getting better care rather than thinking only about costs. Thank you.
Houses and better teeth. That's what we need. Oh, she's got something. That's the 2025 campaign. More houses and better teeth. Okay, lucky last is the boss. Professor Kath Gelber is the head of school. She is an expert on free speech and locates a lot of her, well, all of her work, I guess, in the politics and policies of law. She has too many books to mention, so I'll say she's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. She's a former president of the Australian Political Science Association. She's also the recipient of the Meyer Prize. I think we should just take the Meyer Prize and put it in the school reception. And she's going to talk today about women in politics.
Thanks, Al. So I'll just start. Women in politics obviously is a broad term. We're talking here both obviously about gender identity, but also about policies. Those two things overlap, but they're not synonymous. They're not the same thing. I just wanted to start with looking at, so a lot of people have said that gender has really been a factor in the outcome of the federal election last Saturday, and in particular that the independents have played a significant role in that. And I guess I just wanted to start by giving you the data. These are the non-major MPs who've been elected to the House of Representatives. The one seat that's now still in play doesn't play a role in this because it's a fight between Labor and Liberal, as was McNamara, which was decided this morning. So we're not going to get any more non-major House of Reps people than we currently have. You can see the Greens have 4, which is a very strong result for them compared to historically. Previously, they've only had Adam Bant, although he was re-elected. Very interestingly, 3 out of the 4 of those are men. So that's, I suspect, something that the Greens will want to pay attention to, given that they promote themselves as a social justice focused party. Obviously, the Kath Australian Party has 1 representative in the federal parliament. Apparently, Bob Katter is now the single longest serving MP in the Australian House of Representatives. So that's his claim to fame. The Centre Alliance in South Australia, Rebecca Sharkey, who was elected before, so she was re-elected. And then what you can really see is the independents, right? These are the teal, so-called teal independents, although apparently not all of them used teal. Some of them used orange and pink, but overall that they're being called the teal independents. And I think there's an interesting question moving forward about whether they will coalesce into some kind of a more formal grouping. But these are really interesting results. Dai Lee, a Vietnamese woman from a refugee background who fought off what was an incredibly strong, this was not considered a marginal seat. This was a very safe seat for Labor until they parachuted in Christina Keneally, who has a long pedigree and is a well-known politician, but was an outsider, didn't live in the electorate, and was a white person with blonde hair and blue eyes. And they, in order to parachute in Christina Keneally, the Labor Party took the candidacy away from a local candidate who was also a Vietnamese woman and who lived locally. So Dai Lee winning that was a bit of a punch in the face, I guess, for the Labor Party. Some of the other ones there, you can see them won their seats against coalition members: Trent Zimmerman, Dave Sharma, Tim Wilson, and Josh Frydenberg. Andrew Wilkie has been an independent before, so he was re-elected, as was Zali Steggall. She was in the last parliament as well. So the total number of independents has absolutely increased, and there's a chance that that given the nature of the campaigns that they ran, and mostly, not entirely, but mostly these independents ran on 3 things: do something about climate change, set up an ICAC, and women's issues, politics of gender. And given that strength, given that was their unifying factor, it would not be unexpected if they started to move as a bloc, particularly around those issues. So that's incredibly different. Just to look at the total number of candidates nominated, overall in the entire country, I was adding this up on the weekend, it's about 40% who are nominated. And as you can see, roughly the same in each jurisdiction, although South Australia and Tasmania are a little bit above the trend, and the ACT and New South Wales are a bit below. But in terms of the number of women candidates elected, now this doesn't include McNamara, which was announced this morning, but it does include Stephen Bates, which was announced on the weekend. You can see in New South Wales, it's pretty good. It's about 50-50, and in Victoria, it's not too bad. Queensland's terrible. 25 men and 5 women have been elected to Parliament in Queensland. Absolutely terrible. And so we do have a Greens land. We are Greens land, but we're men's land as well. So, you know, but the worst stat in the country for gender in terms of female politicians elected. WA has more women elected than men. And I will add that many of these women, particularly in places like WA, are also ethnically diverse. WA elected the first woman who wears a headscarf to the Federal House of Representatives in Australian history. So we have First Nations women in the Labor Party. We have Marion Scrimgeour in Lingiari in the Northern Territory, and Linda Burney, who's going to be the new Indigenous Affairs Minister, who's been a long-term member, but we have some others as well. South Australia's almost half, Tasmania's not too bad, ACT and Northern Territory are pretty good. Just to give you a comparison, prior to this federal election, Australia ranked 57th globally for the number of women in Parliament. There's a website there from the Interparliamentary Union, which keeps these data. You can look it up. You can look at the countries that rank above Australia. Rwanda, you know, I can't remember the others. Rwanda's the one that sticks in my head. They're all above us. We're ranked 57th. And we had, in the last Parliament, just prior to this election, 31% women. We've gone from 31% to 42% in this election. And if no one else changes, we would end up roughly 22nd in the world instead of 57th in the world due to the results of this one election. That's how monumental this change is. I was watching the caucus conversation on ABC Live before I came here, but they got to the point where they were going to announce the ministry and they shoved the media out of the room. So I can't tell you who's in the new cabinet, although you will find out when you watch the television news tonight. What I can tell you is that the interim cabinet, there were 5 people sworn into an interim cabinet in time for Albanese and Penny Wong to do a trip to Japan, an official state visit to Japan. And in that interim cabinet, out of 5 people who were sworn in, 2 of them were women, Penny Wong in Foreign Affairs and Katie Gallagher in Attorney General. It's highly likely that Linda Burney will be Indigenous Affairs Minister. It's highly likely that those other 3 women on the slide will get cabinet positions, as will other women as well. I'm not suggesting that that's going to be all of it. But if you look at the last cabinet of the Morrison government, there were 24 cabinet ministers, 8 of whom were women, which again is 33%. Given that we now have 42% of women in the Parliament, I think it's a pretty safe bet that that's likely to go up. And now I guess we talk about whether we have increased representation of women. We have increased identity of women. Does this translate into different policies? Does this translate into different discourse in the bear pit of the Parliament? That's going to be the real test, whether the presence of women actually leads to change. Now, there's a lot of academic literature on this, about whether or not the presence of women leads to actual fundamental policy change or discursive change. Depends a lot on the politics of the women involved. Based on that set of, research, I think given that most of the women that we're talking about, the new women in Parliament, are independents who say that they ran on a platform of women's issues as one of their top 3, I think that it's reasonable for us to expect that there would be a change. Labor's committed to a number of really important things, and not all of them are necessarily women's issues. Universal childcare, for example, free TAFE, that's going to make a difference. Clean energy, of course, more secure work, affordable housing, as well as more obviously women's issues like women's rights at work, addressing family violence, parental leave, universal childcare, and so on. I'll finish up now, but I just didn't want to stop without saying something about trans kids. I can't tell you how repugnant I found it that in the last election, one of the major political coalitions in this country decided to use some of the most vulnerable human beings in our society, some of the most vulnerable children in our society as punching bags by taking a play out of the US right and deciding that these people were so vulnerable and so marginalised that it didn't matter what you did to them, you could use them as a punching bag. And I can't tell you how relieved I was last Saturday night to see that Australia voted against those attacks on trans kids. And good on us. Thank you.
Okay, definitely the prize for soundbite of the day goes to "It's not Greensland, it's Mansland." I think that's. There was also something really nice about knowing the boss was adding up numbers at the weekend. If you're not doing that, you're not a political scientist, I guess. We're going to go now to questions, obviously. I think we already have some online, but we could take a couple in the room while we're waiting. Okay. We'll go there and then we'll go to Mel next.
Hi, my name is Anna. I think your name was Vince, and I'm over at public speaking, so I'll try and bring some questions. But probably you're like out of 10 to the score. What's your optimism on the new government and trying to make your voice confident in the statements?
I realised when I sat down, I should have said those scores are so completely made up. That was basically there for my own entertainment. So I won't give that a score out of 10 because there's so much uncertainty. In one way, they have said much more clearly than anyone else that's committed to a referendum in the next 3 years. And they haven't done what is the signature move of any government that wants to look like they're supporting something that doesn't really want to support it, which is create a commission. Or say there has to be another process. They're going, no, we're going to take this straight to referendum. However, I did see, and this is what gave me a tip for Linda Burney and Anthony Albanese say that they wouldn't take it if there was a risk that it wouldn't succeed. And the government has shown itself to consistently underestimate the appetite for change in this area and in many areas, actually. I think the population is kind of way ahead of the government. And so it worries me if they're starting to use that language of no, the risk, because that's always the story that has led to that being suspended. However, I think they've created a commission for the truth and treaty part. So that's bumped down the road. But I do feel like out of everything, the voice has like really strongest, most concrete potential actually happening next week.
Also, we know as political scientists that only 8 hours industry, and there's been a lot of perceived wisdom around those. One of those bits of perceived wisdom is that a referendum question will get up without bipartisan support. It's predictions are dangerous in politics, but based on what just happened in the federal parliament, I think that we might, for the first time this year, hopefully this year, see a successful referendum that doesn't have bipartisan support, and we'll throw that myth out of the window, because it's very unlikely the coalition will support the statement, but the Australian people just voted for it. So I'm hopeful, and also the entire strategy of the Uluru Statement has been bottom up. It's been build the support among the Australian people first, not top down. And they're still building it. And you can do that. You can join that. You can join that movement of support for it. And that's what will get the referendum through. So fingers crossed.
We do have a question online that does link directly to that. So we might just take that just now as a question for Liz, and then we'll go over to Mel later. So the question is that there's a bit of preamble. During the election campaign, Greens leader Adam Bandt stated that he wanted to see the Uluru Statement Pillars of Truth and Treaty implemented before the voice to Parliament. Labour, however, intends to prioritise a voice to Parliament and referendum. What's your view of this, and which step of the Uluru Plan do you think should be prioritised?
Okay, that's actually a very political question. That's one that's been the source of a great deal of controversy recently in relation to the Greens, and significant dissent through the English statement process. So one of the things that's not often widely kind of known or shared is that there are significant sectors of the Indigenous population that don't support the Uluru government. There was walkouts of the consultation processes. Some of them were around the ordering. So there was kind of some people, Indigenous people, who felt that it was important to have truth telling so that Indigenous communities could heal, and then conversations about fundamental relationship before anything conflict came. And then there were other people who said, no, we need to lock something in to put us into this policy process, which, as I have said, is really flawed and hierarchical and non-consultative. There was a lot of anger, distress, different perspectives about the Greens' decision to take a stance on that ordering issue. And I'm not an Indigenous person, I'm not going to wade into that, but just so people know, there's quite a lot of dissent from a purely political kind of pragmatic perspective. It's the voice is the most concrete thing that we can live on in the short term, partly because those other questions are really long, fundamental, relational questions that have to take time. And there is a lot to be said for having a constitutionally enshrined Indigenous voice, even if it's advisory, because I can't count on two hands the number of Indigenous representative or advisory bodies that have been abolished by government when they overstep their mandate. So I see that.
Okay, we're going to go to Mel next, and then we'll come back to the online stuff. The microphones are a bit low, so give us your best.
Melissa Johnson, also from Policies, and thank you to my wonderful colleagues for a really entertaining Flashpoint. My question is to Adam. You said something that addressing inequality is an electoral risk, or was an electoral risk in 2019. And I really like this phrase, the subtropical organism. I'm going to use that somewhere else. Obviously, problems around inequality, housing, hospitals, these are really pressing issues in Australia. Yet, when we look at what happened, addressing inequality as electoral risk, what does that say about class politics in Australia? Have you got some commentary on that? Have we seen a shift in the class basis of politics, or has it changed rules of the game, or something else?
So when I talk about electoral risk, I think it's actually really hard to evaluate objectively what that electoral risk is. The Labor Party interpreted it as electoral risk, and pointed to things like the changes that they proposed to negative gearing as being a significant reason why they lost the election. I think it's really hard to isolate, the context of a complex campaign, whether there was one particular thing that damaged it. What I would say is that I do think that there is an opportunity for more, let's say, broadly social democratic or redistribution in these sorts of areas, particularly targeting younger people. So you do have an age dimension to this as well as a class dimension. To take the negative gearing example specifically, I mean, I think it's not a good example to generalize about prospects of this type of policy in general in Australia, because it was very poorly understood what negative gearing actually is. Very few people understood actually what the Labor Party was proposing to do. It's very niche sort of area of tax and investment policy. And there wasn't a clear sort of sales pitch around, well, if we change this, this will allow us to provide all of these other things. This is why it will allow more people to make their accounts. I think what people saw is, the Labor Party are attacking the ability to invest in housing for everyone. And I think in Australia, our baseline assumption is investing in housing is the way towards economic security. So I do think that there's a pathway, but it takes a greater degree of sort of cleverness around the messaging and strategy that Labor had. And I think, not to say that the Greens platform is the way forward, but it does show that there is at least
some segments of the electorate that are not wanting these sorts of policies.
I just wondered, the one thing that you said that really stood out to me was the Teal's position and the unlikely event that they really care about inequality. I just wondered if we could maybe expand that to the whole panel and see if we could get views on what they think the Teal position is in relation to their topic. Kath, what do you think? And then we could move the microphone along.
It's actually really hard to tell. So within less than 24 hours of Allegra Spender and Monique Ryan being elected, they were both on television. Allegra Spender saying, I'm a fiscal conservative. I'm concerned about government spending. I think we need to be responsible around government spending. They're going to have to really convince me, we've got to do something about budget deficit. And Monique Ryan was saying, I'm a pragmatist. I'm happy to talk about to the government, basically pushing that, what are your other policies? I'm a pragmatist. I'm prepared to talk to the government. I'm prepared to consider anything that's reasonable. We'll have to have a conversation about that. So the answer is we actually really don't know. Let's not forget that the Teals won their seats off predominantly the Liberal Party in predominantly Conservative seats, blue ribbon seats, Sydney Harbourside seats. And it was the Liberal heartland who lost to the Teals. It was the well-educated women in particular, and it was people relatively speaking, better socioeconomic needs, who tended to vote for many, not all, but many of those Teals. So we don't know yet.
In relation to Indigenous policy, I would suspect, I haven't really studied the platforms of these people, that they would tend to fold support for the ordinary statement into a more general kind of socially progressive agenda, like kind of linking those things, to greater representation for women and for other marginalised groups. And yet would probably, and this is a position that's surprisingly common, not have a kind of critical perspective on some of the actual material structures of Indigenous policy and the way that it's operated in a very neoliberal mode is what I would call it. And that's one of the problems with separating kind of questions of Indigenous politics as if these are kind of symbolic issues from the actual operation of the major state structures in relation to Indigenous people. So that would be my assessment, probably of whether it's.
So the climate one's a lot easier in this regard, obviously, because this was, if not, yeah, probably was the issue that they ran on. And one of the things that made it so difficult for the college is that you essentially had these candidates in not just an issue that was supported where the government's position was opposed by most Australians, but in particular in the seats where they got elected. So to then come in and promise this is one issue we're going to throw the kitchen sink at was equally concerned about, but actually all the other stuff that's been looked broadly similar to what it is at the moment. That's partly why A, so successful, and B, so difficult for the coalition to campaign. I think the issue around class is an interesting one because obviously people, rightly so, are sort of raising questions about the Liberal Party in particular represents in the same way to raise the same question about the National, the Farmers Federation, way ahead of people like Barnaby Joyce and Matt Canavan on climate. But Labor's got some looming issues as well in terms of the constituency that it claims to represent. It's traditionally been a party of the union movement, and yet fewer Australians have ever before the members of unions. Manufacturing sector in this country has been under the for an extended period of time, and clearly in the last election, they've tried to make themselves a small target, and they've worked out if you occupy the centre and just be a little bit better than the coalition on the things that people really care about, and that's the way you win elections. But in the longer term, if they're building a sort of legislative legacy, and there are big questions about how far they push on, some of the social democratic talking about it.
I'm going to go down in the middle, and then I'll go up to Sarah, and then we'll finish up the back. We are running till 15:15, so we've got plenty of time.
Thank you. My question is for Matt. So you talked about the global pressure that the EU will receive to increase its emission targets. What would be the targets so that it's actually aligned with the Paris Agreement? If 43% isn't enough, how much are we talking? And also, what do you consider the chances to actually be able to reach these targets? We've seen in the past that setting the target, especially climate policy, doesn't necessarily mean we will reach it. And to what extent this also plays into the reputation of Australia within the international climate negotiations. With the reputation change, will also be based on the ability of Australia to change its targets and actually hit, or just the change of government already has an impact into how international actors perceive that. Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. They're tough ones. I think you're trusting my knowledge of some of these issues a bit too much, although there's precedent for that. When Professor Gelber said earlier, as political scientists, we all know only 8 of 44 referendums have been successful. I was thinking, yeah, we all know that.
Obviously.
I mean, it goes without saying. So I've seen a couple of estimates, and the tricky thing is, do we use 1.5 as the target for 2? And then what sort of time frame are we talking about in terms of reaching that target? But most of the assessments suggest, in relative terms, that Australia is below what it would need to be, and we need to be close to 60 to be in the ballpark for 2 degrees, even so a big increase. In terms of what might make that target change is, I think the international context would be more likely than the domestic one, because it is an international target as much as anything else, the emissions reduction target. So if there was moves in the next couple of conferences of parties to essentially arrange, so it's not just, because the last time we saw more movement on net zero targets than we did on emissions targets. And of course, as you know, states are supposed to ramp up. If we see ramping up from other countries, that could be the type of context that encourages Labor to say, well, actually, we do need to keep consistent with the terms of the Paris Agreement. We need to keep ramping up those targets, and so that might be a context in which it changes. But I think, was there a third part of your question?
Yeah, the reputation of Australia at the international level.
I think, yeah, so far it's just the reputational issue is great for Australia at the moment, because not being a coalition is a massive victory, and everyone's like, well, thank God, you know, that's well done you. You're not there. It's the next step that's going to be much, much harder though, when countries are actually saying, okay, well, you know, because it's not just that Australia's targets are comparatively low. It's that we're starting from such an easy baseline, in the sense that there's a lot of what we would call low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of things that Australia could do to reduce emissions that countries in Europe, for example, have already been doing for an extended period of time. So there is real capacity for Australia to ramp up its ambition in that space. There's lots of capacity for development of renewable energy and associated infrastructure. So there could be, in reputational terms, it might be that Albanese is in a bit of a honeymoon now, but you know, in 12 months, other countries will be saying, all right, now it's time to really start showing that you're going past these targets. It's really time to show that you're transitioning away, especially from new coal projects and coal exports. And I think that will be a really interesting space. But reputation will matter. It matters as much how much pressure other countries are putting on Australia, I think.
There's a couple of really great questions in the comments that I'm going to try and roll into one. They're less related to policy and more related to politics. One of them is here in front of us, and we are seeing the emergence of a softer side to Peter Dutton. I will put that in air quotes deliberately. And so the question is, the 3 years of opposition politics with Dutton as a leader, how is that going to play out in these typically contentious areas like transgender issues, like asylum, like Indigenous policy? And then the flip side of that is, in the absence of media reform, will the government be able to get its messaging out? So wrapping those together, it's what do you think political communication is going to look like in this parliament?
So you happy for me to take first crack and then pass it on? The media reform thing is just, I would love to see that as a policy. That would be honestly one of my absolute top priorities, to see massive changes in terms of media ownership laws. But that's also something that the government tends to be the previous prime ministers rant about, the ones who've been deposed when they think there's been a Murdoch campaign against them. That's when they rant up, rather than when they're actually not in office for the most part. But the thing is fascinating when you think about recent experience with coalition opposition leaders. The relatively the ones who came a cropper were relatively moderate ones who seemed to suggest they were going to work with the government, and the ones that were comparatively successful, like Abbott, actually just ran a massive spoil and scare campaign. To be fair though, Abbott didn't have to sustain that for 3 years, and that's one of the problems that government has. If he wants to run like Abbott, it's a very difficult thing to sustain that for the type of period of time you need to be solidified as leader and have a chance of actually winning the next election. I think that's a really difficult thing. And actually the example with Turnbull was as much that Labor couldn't seem to resist the chance to try to wedge him and demonstrate how wedged he was with the hardliners in the conservative side of politics. I suspect if something like that came up again, I think Albanese, I get the sense he's got more nous than to play it like rugby at the time with Turnbull over carbon pricing. But yes, predictions in this case.
That's basically what I was going to say. I think about it in opposition, and I worry about Peter Dutton.
The choice of Peter Dutton as the leader was an interesting one, as has been at least media reporting of the self-reflection of the Liberals about the for their loss, not just the Liberals. And of course, they're not the only party to draw the wrong lessons. It was very much my view that when Labor lost the 2019 federal election, that they drew some pretty incorrect lessons out of the reason why they lost that election. So it's not unusual people to draw the wrong lessons, but to install Dutton as leader says something, and their move on election day to get Border Force to announce the vote from Sri Lanka, that somebody in the media, I can't remember who it was, Catherine Murphy, somebody said she heard a rumour 3 weeks earlier, and there was apparently, there's a rumour that this was planned. So these are not good signs for the lesson being. You've lost your heartland, you've lost your core. There's also been some criticisms by the Liberal Party that people who voted for Teals have just, gone nuts, and they've just, Liberal Party is their party, and we should really understand that the Liberal Party is their party. So they really, and for a long time, of course, we saw when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, the Liberal Party has increasingly been kind of controlled, run by a more right-wing faction, and so the social Liberals and the people on the wets of the Liberals have been progressively pushed out, and making Dutton leader means that move. So if they continue that move, they may find it difficult to get much traction in opposition. It depends really on how they approach issues, and if they stick to the playbook that they tried in the election, which failed them, which is the US politics playbook, play to the right. The thing on the news media is interesting. So Australia benefits enormously, in my view, from a compulsory voting system, and we saw that on election night, where even though only a third of people could bring themselves to vote Labor as their primary vote, they voted Labor as their second preference, because that's what preferential voting is. We prefer it to be this party than that party, and that worked. The fact that we have compulsory voting, I think, in Australia helps to prevent really big swings to one side or another, not entirely prevent it, but it minimises the risk. And we had a lot of disinformation in this campaign, especially from the United Australia Party and their campaign slogans, freedom, 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 there your freedom stares the poop out of me, I think so. And promises that they literally did not have the constitutional or statutory authority to fulfil. around promises on interest rates and, you know, just completely ludicrous things that they, even if they were elected, there was literally no legal way for them to achieve the things that they were promising. And I was worried. I didn't know how that was going to run. He said $100 million, and yet he got one. He got one in Victoria. And that indicates to me that in spite of very significant amounts of disinformation and supported by large amounts of money, that the Australian people in a compulsory voting system still take their responsibility to inform themselves relatively seriously, and that's a positive thing. So I do think that the compulsory voting system helps us out a little bit. It doesn't solve everything, but it worked out well this time.
Very briefly, maybe I'll just pivot back and totally contradict what I was saying before. You know, as I said, there is a constituency for this more social democratic sort of voting policy. If I was, you know, advising the Liberal Party, I think maybe sticking to economics would be the best way to go. One of the lessons from the campaign is the social conservatism. I think it didn't work that well. If we have a very high, if we continue to have difficult economic conditions, particularly around like inflation, cost of living going up, I will be pivoting as soon as you can make that claim viably, which is probably not going to be too long, that the Albanese government's economic management is poor, and potentially I can see them trying to tie Labor and the Greens together as being sort of profligate, pivoting back to the classic debt and deficit kind of message, could reassure some of their voters in the city. The media question, I think, is a really interesting one. I think it's a bit of an unknown. We've been talking a bit about this in my first year Australian politics subject, is whether, particularly the Murdoch media, but also, you know, we've really got sort of two major media companies and a handful of smaller ones, the Channel 9 and the old Fairfax papers, whether they have the influence that they used to, or whether we assumed they had at the time. Particularly, you know, younger people are not reading newspapers, they're not watching broadcast network TV. There is diversity online, even though we have very concentrated media environment. I think reforming those media ownership laws would be a good idea, but I'm also not necessarily persuaded by the sort of broad narrative that Murdoch is able to, you know, kill a Labor government with a few headlines in the Courier Mail. So.
Okay, we might go up the back first and then finish with Sarah. Perfect. Then we go up the back. Thank you.
Thanks very much, guys. Just my question's more on the policy space. I think, so the whole panel, what does the future of the Australian public service look like? I think, like, in Matt's area, in terms of DFAT, like, we've got someone heading up DFAT at the moment who has no foreign policy experience, has been shifted around the public service and might be an admirable public servant, but is not an expert. And I think some of the current events have shown that we do really need experts. Like COVID has shown us we need an expert at the top of the health department. And I think the current events in the Pacific Islands show we need an expert at the top of DFAT. And then if we're talking about the NDIS going forward, we need experts in those fields at the top of the public service. And I think the last 20 years, the trend to outsourcing government, you know, through the big four consulting firms has been quite large. So is a Labor government going to deliver that, or is there scope for the public to influence to say, no, we need public services? I think there's this narrative going around that we don't need public service, but I think we all recognise in this room that expertise at the top of those major government organisations is really important.
Yeah, great question. Public administration question. Excellent.
Very, very brief. I mean, that is a fantastic question. I mean, I think maybe one point that I would take away from the COVID experience is that there is pretty high trust in public services in Australia. I don't fully buy this hollowing out of the state narrative. Our public sector is really large. I agree with the point. I would definitely agree with is the role of consulting firms in contracting out. I think it's a problem. I heard Jim Chalmers talking about this a little bit, so there seems to be a bit of a bit away from the reliance on consulting firms. I think that is a good thing to see. But doing something really systematic about regenerating a public service, I mean, it would be partly like turning around the Titanic. You know, we live in a world a very close relationship between public and private sector. But I do take the point definitely about the role of consultants, sure.
So today, Glenn Davis is announced as the head of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Glenn Davis is a former Vice Chancellor of Melbourne University and Griffith University, a public administration scholar in our tradition. And as you came up through the ranks of political science departments, very highly capable human being who's most recently was running the Ramsay Foundation, so developing initiatives and fundraising and social policy. That's a good sign. Glenn Davis also apparently ran the Queensland Public Service under Beatty, and apparently also did something under that. So he's a very experienced human being, very capable person. Obviously, you can't fix everything overnight. I agree with now there are stronger connections now between the public and private sector, but I wonder also if there could be an interaction between this question and the pledge by the Labor government to reintroduce more secure forms of work. Because of course the public sector, as opposed to consultancy, private consultancies, that's a more secure form of work. So it would be consistent with their pledge to reintroduce more, to expand opportunities for more secure forms of work, to slightly at least expand the public sector and reduce the reliance on consultancies. Also another thing that they might do there is that even though the outgoing Morrison government certainly wasn't a big fan of a big public sector, there was a report I saw just before the election on the massive expansion of what you might call jobs for boys under the Morrison government, by which I mean that public positions like tribunal members and those kinds of things were heavily stacked in partisan ways, and that those appointments were partisan. And so I think that was regarded as one of the sort of corruption type allegations, one of the areas in which the Morrison government didn't approach their public duty with integrity. And so I'd be hoping to see a bit of a slowdown of that, of those types of appointments as well. Although, having said that, this current government is going to be able to appoint the new Chief Justice of the High Court and another Justice of the High Court. One's term is roughly, I think, due to end in 23 and one in 24. One this year. So, yeah, so that'll be a great opportunity for them to shape the bench of the High Court.
I guess while I also would question the kind of following out of the state, the state has all kinds of capacities, some of them increasing. I really agree with your point about there has been a long-term trend in the public sector towards suspicion of specialisation and expertise and a move to kind of generalists. And some of that, I think, comes from that neoliberal suspicion of the state and the kind of worry about specialists going rogue because they spend too much time in their area. And I think that's been a really devastating. So the capacity that's been lost is analytical capacity and knowledge and relationships. And in some kind of complex areas like Indigenous policy, that's been really devastating. They have been at certain points reduced to hot desking. People can't get the same person on the phone. They're outsourcing things to Deloitte. The constant moves have led to lots of, kind of serial exodus of Indigenous public servants and others with knowledge in that area. And if COVID did have the kind of effect of challenging that particular change, like long-term trend, that I would see that as a really positive thing.
So I'd probably view this room as a bit of an outlier in the sense of, could you build and sustain a strong constituency of Australians who are worried about the prospects for Canberra-based Commonwealth Government public servants? I'm not sure that was an election opportunity miss for either side. But I mean, in some ways, I'm more concerned about the politicisation of the upper levels of the public service and the role that's played. Because to me, that trend is one that has really changed the nature of, in some ways, what public service was supposed to be. And it's changed its role as an independent, expert-based advice to government, to one in which there's more of a how do you facilitate the government's agenda rather than other opportunities to push back against it. In a specific area of foreign policy, I think DFAT's been spectacularly underfunded for a while, especially in terms of aid. And that's an area where consultancy and phantom aid has been such a big issue for a long period of time. I would expect that to change both because of the ideology of Labor and the tendency they've had in the past to spend more on aid. But also, I think one of the big issues here is that you actually have a massive cabinet heavy hitter in Wong as Foreign Minister, and I think that's going to make a real difference to the prospects for the DFAT relative to what was
Okay, well, we are out of time. Before we thank our panel in the usual way, I just want them to note that I've taken a note of every prediction that they've made. And we'll return in 3 years and form into our own integrity commission, and we'll hold them to account, and there'll be demotions if there's any
Might you
mistake.
be running for office on your platform of better secret more house?
I'm adding that. Social science prediction is now on the platform too. Thank you all for the wonderful questions. Let's thank our panel in the usual way. And apologies to the people at home. I know the mics were up and down, but we got through some questions at least. Thanks, everybody.